Close your eyes. Breathe in slowly. Let your thoughts drift far from the noise of today, phones, screens, news feeds. We're going back, not to the shiny part of the Middle Ages, not castles or tournaments, but to the shadows, to where secrets walked on two legs, to where someone's heartbeat could mean someone else's silence. This is the world of the medieval assassin. And it was awful. Not thrilling, not noble, not clever, just grim. You might imagine them, hooded, graceful, slipping through moonlit corridors with poisoned daggers. But the truth? It was far less cinematic. The real assassin didn't wear stylish cloaks or quote Latin epigrams. They wore dirt, lice, blisters from weeks of walking, and fear, heavy like a second skin. Because the first truth is this: assassins didn't live long. They weren't trained in temples by blind swordmasters. They were desperate people. Criminals offered a deal. Orphans raised by cruel hands. Foreigners with no ties to the land. Ex-soldiers too broken to return to peace. They were picked because no one would miss them if they failed. And most of them did. Killing someone in the Middle Ages, especially someone important, was an impossible task. Castles had walls. Towns had guards. And nobles were surrounded by men with swords who'd love nothing more than to carve you apart to prove their loyalty. So the assassin had to wait. For days, weeks, sometimes months. In alleys, barns, inside the cold stone of someone else's cellar. Eating rats, bread with mold, stale water, and waiting for a single window of weakness. But here's the worst part. Even if you succeeded, even if your blade found the neck of a prince or a corrupt bishop, there was no glory. No statue. No warm bed. Just running. Because now you were being hunted. By soldiers. By bounty hunters. By the same kind of men you once worked for. And if they caught you, death would be a mercy. Most likely, they'd keep you alive just long enough to tell them who sent you. Which brings us to the second truth. Assassins didn't work alone. They always had handlers. People who gave the orders. Delivered the coin. Picked the targets. And these people, powerful lords, rich merchants, religious fanatics, would do everything to stay clean. So if you failed, they'd pretend they never met you. And if you succeeded, they might silence you anyway, just in case. In this game, everyone was disposable. And the assassin was the most disposable of all. There's a story from Milan in the 1300s. A poor stonemason was paid to stab a bishop who had sided with a rival city. He studied the bishop's habits for 2 weeks. Found him alone in a chapel. Struck fast, a blade to the heart. Then he ran. But the guards caught him at the city gate. When they tortured him, he cried out the name of the noble who paid him. That noble had him executed anyway. Said he was a thief. Burned the stonemason's body. Erased him from the records. But the bishop's blood never came off the chapel floor. And people whispered about it for years. That's what being an assassin meant. You were a whisper, a shadow, a mistake no one wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes, the worst part wasn't the danger. It was the isolation. You couldn't trust anyone, couldn't tell anyone who you were, couldn't sleep soundly, had to live with what you did, even if your target deserved it. Because killing still leaves stains. Not always on your hands. Sometimes on your mind. The lucky ones retired, started new lives far away. But most were caught before they turned 30. And those who lasted, they weren't whole. They were ghosts walking in daylight. Tonight, as you lie still, imagine this life. A sack of rusty coins under your cloak. A hidden dagger against your thigh. Every sound might be a tale. Every shadow might be death. And yet, you keep walking. Because you have a name. A face. A target. And once, long ago, someone told you that if you did this, just this one job, you'd be free. They lied, but you still believe, because believing is all you have. Let that thought drift across your mind like a cloud. Let it settle, heavy, soft. You don't have to admire this world. Just understand it, and sleep will come, quietly, like an assassin, but gentler. Not all assassins worked alone. In some corners of the medieval world, they worked in groups, religious ones, political ones, sometimes both. And the most feared of them all were called the Hashishin. Yes, the word you're thinking of. Assassin. That's where it comes from. But the real story behind that name? It's not about throwing stars or jumping from rooftops. It begins high in the mountains of Persia, sometime around the 11th century. There, a man named Hassan I Saba built a fortress called Alamet, Eagle's Nest. And from that impossible peak, surrounded by snow, rock, and silence, he created a secret order. An Islamic sect, Shia, Ismaili. They were persecuted, hunted, so they struck back, not with armies, but with knives, quiet ones, personal ones. They believed they were serving God, striking down tyrants, traitors, enemies of the true faith. But they didn't kill randomly. They studied, they waited, for weeks, months, years, sometimes. Their targets were high-ranking officials, generals, even kings, and they killed them, not with poison or arrows from afar, but up close. Always up close, because part of their creed was this: the victim should see death coming. That was the punishment, the terror, the clarity. Imagine it. You are a powerful warlord. You've just crushed a rival province. You're celebrating in a mosque or a private bathhouse. And someone who's worked as your servant for 3 years suddenly pulls a blade and whispers, "For Alamet." And it's over. Just like that. They didn't run afterward. They expected to die. In fact, many welcomed it, because martyrdom, they believed, was a gateway to paradise. Now, about that name, Hashishin. It's true that some chroniclers claimed they used hashish before their missions. To dull fear, to enter trance, to accept death. But it's also true those claims were made by their enemies. The Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Seljuks, who feared them, and needed to demonize them. So maybe the drugs were real. Maybe not. But the fear? That was very real. European knights brought stories of the assassins back with them. They said these men could appear from nowhere. That they trained from birth. That they climbed castle walls like cats. That they were not quite human. But again, stories. The truth? They were just men, wearing robes, climbing over rocks, getting calluses, catching dysentery, crying when no one could hear. They weren't mythical. They were methodical. They sent messages, sometimes, before the strike. A dagger placed on a pillow. A knife driven into the doorpost of a palace. A letter with no return address. It was psychological warfare. Your enemy starts losing sleep, looking over his shoulder. That alone could be as effective as blood. But Alamet was not eternal. Eventually, the Mongols came, like they always did, and they crushed the fortress. Brick by brick, fire and steel. And the assassins? Scattered. Some say they fled west, to Syria, to Egypt. Some say their order quietly ended. But the legend didn't die. It twisted, turned, became something else. In time, the word assassin lost all connection to faith, to justice. It just meant a killer in the dark. And that leads us back to Europe, where by the 14th century, assassination had become an asterisk industry. Lords hired spies. Spies hired blades. Blades didn't ask questions. There was no brotherhood, no mountains, just coin. One Florentine nobleman wrote, "Better to pay 2 knives than 50 mercenaries." It was cost-effective, and harder to trace, but that made it more dangerous for the killer. Because now there was no cause, no code, no name, just risk, and silence. Some assassins tried to unionize. Believe it or not, they formed loose guilds, protected each other, charged standardized rates. But that didn't last. You can't build trust in a profession that begins with betrayal. Still, there were rules. A good assassin didn't kill women or children, didn't torture, worked clean. But not everyone followed them. Some got sloppy, some went mad, and some enjoyed it. Those were the ones even their peers feared. Not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't feel. Guilt, regret, sleep. They were the walking dead. And even they didn't last. Because someone always came for them. Eventually. A client they double-crossed. A noble they failed to kill. Or just time. Time, which doesn't care if you were invisible. Which doesn't forget. Which grinds down every shadow into dust. Tonight, maybe that's the softest thought of all. That even those who live in darkness eventually lie down and sleep, like you. So breathe again. Slow, safe, still. Because for once, no one is watching. Let's leave the mountains now. Let the snow of Alamet melt behind your mind. Because the assassin's shadow didn't just haunt Persian cliffs or battlefields. It reached the velvet-draped corridors of palaces. It sat beside kings, kissed queens, poured wine, laughed at court jesters, and sometimes, gently, carefully, removed someone from history. Not with a sword, not with a scream, but with a whisper, a nudge, a tiny drop of something dark in the bottom of a silver cup. In the courts of Europe, assassination was not a job. It was an asterisk art. Because here, the killer wore silk, had clean fingernails, knew Latin, and understood that to take a life, you didn't always need a weapon. Just timing. Let's take you to France. The court of King Charles VI. Around 1407, the king was mentally unwell, sometimes thought he was made of glass. That left a power vacuum, and two men filled it. One was Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's brother. The other was John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. They were supposed to be allies. But their rivalry grew bitter. They accused each other of corruption, treason, even sorcery. Until one night, Louis was riding back from visiting the queen. His guards were relaxed. They weren't expecting trouble. Why would they? It was Paris. It was home. But as the street narrowed near Rue Vieille du Temple, a group of masked men stepped out from the shadows. They pulled him from his horse and butchered him. Blades, clubs, fury. His hand was nearly severed from trying to block the blows. When it was done, they fled, but not far. Because this wasn't a robbery. It was a message. John the Fearless admitted to ordering the hit. He said it was for the good of France. Said Louis was corrupt, a traitor, a seducer of queens. The people believed him. And the act of murder became, somehow, patriotic. Let that sink in. This was the power of court assassination. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the narrative after. If you controlled the story, you controlled the truth. And that made the real assassins not the ones with blood on their hands, but the ones with ink on the page. Royal secretaries, chroniclers, clerics who rewrote sermons. And so, the killer vanished, wrapped in political justification, folded into law, necessary evil. But if you peel that layer off, what's left? A man, or men, paid to beat another man to death in the mud. One of them later confessed. He said the Duke's eyes were open until the last blow, and that he didn't scream. That somehow made it worse. Even centuries later, the stones on that street remember. Sometimes the blood doesn't wash away. Now let's shift to England. A different kind of court. A different kind of plot. The year is 1327. King Edward II has been deposed by his own wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward is locked away in Berkeley Castle. No trial, no execution, just quiet disappearance. But there's a problem. Edward is still alive. And alive means dangerous. So one night, someone enters his chamber. We don't know who. We don't know how. But the legends say this: that a red-hot poker was used. Why? Because it left no visible wounds. It was cruelty disguised as cleverness. A death that could be denied. Natural causes, they said. But everyone knew. They just couldn't prove it. And that's the terrifying elegance of court assassins. Their job was to erase, not just the person, but the very idea of murder. To leave no trace. To let doubt cover the truth like snow over a corpse. And it worked. Because the body of Edward II was buried. And the killer? Vanished. Maybe paid off. Maybe killed to keep the secret. Maybe still breathing, hidden behind a new name. But the silence around his death? That became the model. Because if you want to learn how medieval courts handled inconvenient people, you don't look for swords. You look for disappearances. Ambassadors who never returned. Cousins who fell downstairs. Mistresses who drowned in still lakes. Priests who choked on bread in locked rooms. And always, someone ready to say, "What a tragedy." But of course, it was just an accident. Assassination wasn't outlawed in court. It was outsourced. Delegated, refined into something palatable, unseen, undiscussed, but understood by everyone, like rot behind the wallpaper. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close, think not of the blade, but of the silk glove that handed it over, of the pen that erased the name, of the man who waited 3 days after the feast to strike, so no one would suspect the pie. That was the real assassin. Quiet, invisible, patient, And probably already gone before the body hit the floor. Sleep now. You're safe. No one at court knows your name. You're thinking of a man, aren't you? When I say, assassin, your mind probably paints a hooded figure. A dagger. A shadow behind a throne. But what if the deadliest assassin in the room wore silk slippers? What if she was the one offering the wine? Or smoothing the sheets? Or whispering something sweet just before your heart stopped? In medieval history, female assassins didn't look like killers. That's what made them so effective. They didn't kick down doors. They walked through them, invited, trusted, and when the time was right, they didn't need swords. They had access. Let's begin in Italy. Because no list of deadly women is complete without the Borgia family. Yes, those Borgias. Renaissance nobles dripping in gold, secrets, and blood. Lucrezia Borgia is the name history loves to whisper. The poisoner in pearls. The duchess with a deadly dowry. But here's the twist, she may not have been a killer at all. Much of what we know, or think we know, comes from her enemies. She was accused of poisoning lovers, of hosting incestuous banquets, of wearing hollow rings with secret venom. But historians now suspect much of it was smear. Still, the fact that her name survives as * synonymous with female murder says something. Because the fear was real. Not necessarily of * Lucrezia, but of what she represented. A woman with * power. With beauty. With motive. And with means. And that terrified men. Because how do you defend against someone who's smiling when they kill you? Let's shift to France. To a woman whose reputation might have been earned. Catherine de' Medici. Queen, regent, matriarch, and, some say, murderer. It was said that she kept a cabinet of poisons. That she had apothecaries on call the way others had chefs. She was blamed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. For the death of her daughter's enemies. For gifting gloves laced with mercury. She even allegedly used a book, an herbal volume so steeped in nightshade and belladonna. It could kill by touch. Were all of these true? Maybe not. But the fear was. And in court, fear was just as useful as a knife. Because poison is a coward's weapon, they say. But in the hands of a queen? It becomes strategy. A way to wage war without marching armies. And often, no one could prove it. Because poison doesn't leave bruises. It leaves doubt, whispers, uneasy glances at the soup bowl. And suddenly, everyone at court is a little more careful. But not all women assassins hid behind poison. Some used blades. And they weren't always noble. In 1420s Spain, there are records of a woman, her name lost, hired by a merchant to eliminate a rival. She posed as a laundress. She entered the house in broad daylight. And when the master was alone, she cut his throat with the string from a linen sack. Then she folded the bloody cloth into her basket and left. No one suspected the woman carrying laundry. That was her disguise. Until the basket started leaking. And by then, she was gone. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't revenge. It was economics. She needed the coin. And this job paid double what spinning thread did in a month. So she said yes. And in doing so, entered the shadowy ranks of women who killed not for politics, but for survival. There are other names. Tofana of Palermo, who sold acqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless poison, to unhappy wives across Italy. Hundreds of deaths, they say, hidden behind natural causes. She was executed, eventually, but not before her recipe lived on. Passed quietly, carefully, hand to hand, mother to daughter. Because sometimes, assassination wasn't a single act. It was a * tradition. A skill, like weaving or herbalism, learned in silence, practiced in secret. And you might say, you're asleep now, or nearly. But imagine this. Your name is whispered long after you're gone. Not because people loved you, but because they're afraid you're still watching. That's the strange afterlife of an assassin. Sometimes, your real crimes fade away. And in their place? A story, a myth, a shadow that walks without you. Let's begin in the east. Back to where this journey started, the mountains of Persia. The assassins of Alamut. You remember them, don't you? What you may not know, is that most of what we believe about them might be * lies. Crafted by their enemies. Or maybe, exaggerated by admirers. Marco Polo, yes, the traveler, wrote of them. He said their leader, the old man of the mountain, kept young men drugged on hashish, that he promised them paradise, only to wake them and say, "You want that again? Then kill for me." It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and almost certainly, it's asterisk fiction, but it stuck. And for centuries, the word assassin didn't mean killer. It meant follower of Hassan I-Saba. Even the word itself, assassin, may come from hashishin, users of hashish. But modern scholars argue, it's probably a slur, a label used by enemies. The real assassins? They were political, strategic. They killed with intent, not chaos. But try telling that to a frightened crusader hearing rumors of silent blades in the dark. Sometimes, the myth is more useful than the truth. Jump forward now, to Renaissance Italy. To a man named Cesare Borgia. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, that pope. And Cesare? A prince, a commander, a seducer, and some say, a serial killer. Niccolò Machiavelli, author of the Prince, admired him. He wrote that Cesare understood power, understood when to show mercy, and when to use the knife. But Caesar's death was almost poetic. He died in exile, ambushed while riding alone, his armor stripped, his body left naked in the dirt. Yet even today, people debate how many he killed, how much blood he spilled for his father. Did he personally stab his brother out of jealousy? Did he poison cardinals at feasts? Or was he just another tool in the hands of a corrupt church? We may never know, because after a while, Cesare became less of a man, and more of a asterisk type. The dark prince, the cold strategist, and every time someone rises to power with a smile and a blade, Caesar's ghost gets a little stronger. Legends work like that. They don't rest in tombs. They live in repetition. But there's another side to this. Some assassins became asterisk heroes. Folk saints of the blade. Like William Tell in Switzerland. He's remembered for shooting an apple off his son's head. But the deeper tale? He was forced to do it by a tyrannical official. And afterward, Tell killed that official, sparking a rebellion. Was Tell real? Historians doubt it. There's no solid evidence. But Swiss people believed in him. They built statues, named streets, wrote songs. Because sometimes, a asterisk mythical assassin is more powerful than a real one. He becomes the voice of justice. A whisper of hope. A reminder that the powerful can bleed. Same with Robin Hood. A thief, yes, but also a killer in many tales. An outlaw who struck from the forest. And vanished. He, too, probably never lived. Or if he did, not like the legends say. But his myth? Eternal. Why? Because we want to believe. That one person, with skill and purpose, can change everything. And that's the heart of the assassin myth. It's not just about death. It's about asterisk agency. Control. A single figure. Standing against systems. Kings. Armies. It speaks to something in us. Especially when we feel powerless. And that's why assassins became more than just historical footnotes. They became symbols. Some feared. Some worshipped. But all remembered. So tonight, as you lie still, imagine this. What story would follow you if the world forgot the facts? What whispers would survive? Would they be of blood? Or bravery? Or something stranger? Something you never intended? Because history is full of ghosts. And some of them, we built ourselves. Out of fear. Out of longing. Out of silence. And once built, they don't go away. They linger. Just like you now, hovering at the edge of sleep. Soft. Unseen. Almost gone, but not quite. And somewhere, centuries away, someone lights a candle, tells a tale, mentions your name, not as a person, but as a legend. Imagine this. You spend your life in silence. You hide in shadows. You obey without question. You kill for causes you don't always understand. And when you're done, there's no statue. No song. Not even a name etched into stone. You are forgotten. Because that's the truth behind many medieval assassins. They didn't become legends. They vanished. Erased by time. Or erased asterisk on purpose. Because a true assassin isn't meant to be remembered. They're meant to disappear. Let's talk about those ghosts. The ones history barely whispers about. Start with the nameless mercenaries of the Crusades. Men, and sometimes women, hired not by kings, but by merchants, nobles, bishops. They weren't religious zealots. They didn't fight for glory. They were paid, given a target, a name, a face, and sent off into a city or battlefield or bedroom, with orders to end a life. And when it was done, they were paid again, if they survived. Sometimes they were killed by the same hands that hired them. Fewer witnesses. After all, no loyalty, no honor, just a job. Like the story from the early 1200s. A Hungarian noble hires a man to eliminate his rival in a border dispute. The assassin succeeds, slips past guards, kills with a garrote in the snow. But he makes one mistake. He leaves a scrap of cloth behind. It leads back to him. And instead of protecting his hired killer, the noble turns him in, declares he was attacked too. The assassin is tortured, then hanged. His name isn't even recorded. Only his method. A footnote. A warning. Or consider the bodyguards turned traitors. You see them more than you'd think. Trusted men. Personal protectors. Given keys to chambers. Schedules. Blind trust. And then, one night, the blade turns. Was it gold? Revenge? Blackmail? We'll never know. The only thing recorded is the betrayal. Sometimes not even that. Because when a bodyguard fails, history focuses on the victim, not the killer. The assassin becomes a shadow. Faceless. Erased. And what about those who failed? We rarely talk about them. But they existed. Assassins caught in the act. Or those who missed their mark and ran. Captured. Executed. Forgotten. No one tells their stories. Because they didn't shape history. They just ended. Like a candle blown out before the flame could matter. And then, there's guilt. Some killers lived long enough to regret. Letters from the 14th and 15th centuries exist, mostly confessions written by men in monasteries. Or dictated to scribes after capture. One wrote, "Greater than, I took coin from a man whose face I never saw. The bishop died 3 nights later. I was told to leave the city. So I walked. For 30 years I have walked." Another, "Greater than, the child cried when I cut the father's throat. I did not mean to see that. I thought the house would be empty." We read those words and feel something human. Not justice, not nobility, just weariness. A man remembering not the kill, but the sound of it. And that, perhaps, is the most painful truth. Most assassins didn't die in battle or blaze. They died alone. In fields, in forests, in prison cells, without fanfare, without legacy. Just a heartbeat, then silence. And maybe, they wanted it that way. Maybe the silence was the only peace they ever got. Because a life in shadows eats you. No friendships. No roots. Every town is a threat. Every meal might be your last. And even if you live, what do you have? You can't write a memoir. You can't tell your children. You can't even pray without wondering who's watching. That's what it really meant. To be a medieval assassin. Not the elegance of fantasy. Not the cool detachment of fiction. But hunger. Fear. Regret. 1,000 sleepless nights. Until the last one finally comes. So tonight, let that be your final thought. That even the killers, the sharpest, the fastest, the most feared, were still human. They bled. They aged. They wept. And in the end, the shadows they lived in swallowed them whole. Let them rest there now. And you, drift softly. No need to run. No need to hide. Just breathe. Just close your eyes. The night is quiet now. The blades are gone. And nothing in the dark is waiting for you. Not tonight. Not anymore. It's cold. Colder than you expected. Not just the air, but the stone beneath your skin. The iron at your wrists. The silence inside your skull. You're a prisoner now. And in the Middle Ages, that's not just a status. It's a sentence. Not always to death, but often to something worse. Forget clean cells and organized systems. This is not prison as you know it. There are no rights, no consistent rules, no fair trials. Sometimes, there's not even a crime. Only power. And you don't have any. Let's begin with the building itself. When we say medieval prison, most people imagine castles with dungeons beneath them, flickering torchlight, damp stone walls, rats the size of dogs. And, well, that's not entirely wrong. But the truth is messier. Prisons in the early Middle Ages weren't centralized. They weren't meant to hold people long-term. They were more like temporary waiting rooms, dark, brutal, and inescapable. You weren't locked up for years. You were held until someone decided what to do with you. Pay a fine? Good. You're free. Refuse? Get tortured. No money? No connections? You might just rot. or hang. It depended on the mood of the lord, or the priest, or whoever claimed authority that day. Many towns didn't even have prisons in the modern sense. Instead, people were shoved into pits, towers, cisterns, anywhere that could be sealed off. Some cells were carved out of cliffs. Others were underground vaults, repurposed from old Roman structures. And yes, some were actual dungeons beneath castles. But those were usually reserved for political prisoners, not thieves or drunks. In fact, some of the worst places weren't underground at all. They were cages, wooden or iron boxes suspended in public view. You didn't die there right away. You sat, exposed to the elements, mocked by passers-by, sometimes fed, sometimes not, and if you didn't die of exposure, you might die of shame, or from what the crowd threw. Let's talk about who ended up in these places. Not just murderers or traitors. Anyone could land in a medieval prison. Steal a loaf of bread? Maybe a night in the stocks. Or a week in a holding pit. Speak against the local bishop? Suddenly, you're an enemy of God. Owe money to the wrong merchant? Welcome to debtor's prison. In fact, by the later Middle Ages, debt asterisk became one of the most common reasons people were imprisoned. And it wasn't a short sentence. You stayed until you paid what you owed. Which, of course, you couldn't, because you were locked up and couldn't work. It became a trap. Families would have to sell land, tools, even children into service to free one imprisoned parent. The irony was brutal. The poorer you were, the longer you stayed, and the longer you stayed, the more forgotten you became. You'd think, then, that there were at least basic rights. There weren't, unless you were nobility. A knight accused of treason might get a clean room in a tower. A commoner got a hole in the ground. Torture? Not guaranteed, but always possible. Especially under church authorities. The Inquisition was infamous for its methods. Not just burning or flaying, but long-term psychological torment, isolation, blindfolding, sleep deprivation, not always in service of truth. Sometimes in service of confession. Whether it was true or not. But even secular jails had horrors of their own. In London's Newgate prison, for example, cells were so crowded that prisoners slept sitting up. Bodies often stayed for days before removal. There was no sewage system, no ventilation, and no separation of crimes. A pickpocket might be thrown into the same room as a murderer. And both would die coughing, starving, or worse. Disease spread faster than rumors. And rats, real rats, ran the place. They chewed through clothing, through limbs, through hope. And the guards? Not there to protect you. They were often unpaid. Instead, they lived off asterisk bribes. Want food? Pay. Want a blanket? Pay. Want to send a letter? Pay. Everything cost something, even survival. And if you had nothing? Then you became nothing. Sometimes, not even a name in the ledger. Just a stain on the wall. But perhaps worst of all was time. Medieval prisoners had no clocks, no schedules, no sense of passing days. Some were thrown in and simply forgotten. No trial, no record, just sealed in a cell that might not open again until someone stumbled upon the bones. And for those who did get out, the nightmare often followed them. Crippled bodies from damp and disease, disfigurement from shackles, permanent damage from beatings, and the social stain never washed off. Even if you were innocent, even if you were released, you had been inside, and that made you suspect forever. So tonight, as you lie down in safety, in warmth, in softness, remember this. There were once people just like you. With families, with hopes, with tiny dreams. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you can still hear it. The clank of the door closing. The way it echoed, not once, but again and again, bouncing off stone. Bouncing off your chest, like a bell tolling just for you. You were inside. And now, you belonged to the walls. In the medieval world, imprisonment was less about rehabilitation, and more about humiliation, sometimes punishment, sometimes purgatory, but rarely mercy. You may not have been sentenced yet, but you were already condemned. Let's go deeper. Let's look at asterisk how people were held. We often imagine barred cells and uniform chambers. But most medieval prisons were haphazard. One city's jail might be a collapsed granary. Another, a disused gatehouse. There was no blueprint, no safety standards, just whatever could be locked. In some towns, they used dry wells, hollowed out holes covered by wooden planks. Drop a person in. Seal the top. Forget. If the jailer remembered to lower food, you might live. If not, well, the silence would take you faster than hunger. And then there were oubliettes. It comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. Because that was the point. An oubliette was a vertical pit, narrow, deep, nearly impossible to climb. Prisoners were lowered in, sometimes without injury, sometimes not. Once inside, you were given nothing. Maybe food, maybe water, but not always. Sometimes the oubliette wasn't just a holding space. It was the sentence. You weren't meant to be retrieved. You were meant to disappear. Let's stay with that feeling for a moment, of being disappeared. Because that's how many prisoners described the experience. One man, writing from Bruges in the late 13th century, said, "Greater than, I cannot know the sun or moon. The light has forgotten me." Another, a woman arrested during a heresy raid. "Greater than, I spoke truth but was buried in silence. My body hurt, but my name hurt more, they would not say it." That's what it meant to be a prisoner back then. Not just loss of freedom. Loss of identity. You weren't a person anymore. You were a problem to be held. Until solved, or dissolved. This gets worse if you were arrested by church authorities. During the Inquisition, suspects could be held indefinitely before formal questioning even began. They were often held in solitary cells. In pitch black, sometimes for weeks. Why? Because the darkness broke you. Not just emotionally, but physically. Without light, the body begins to disorient. Appetite vanishes. Vision blurs. Time stretches. One prisoner, after just 17 days in darkness, began hallucinating a second door in his cell, one that never existed. He banged on it for hours. Begged to be let out. The guard, hearing his cries, laughed and told him, "That door is in your head. Maybe escape through that." And speaking of guards, they were rarely heroes in these stories. Some were just as poor as the prisoners. They'd steal food rations to feed their own families. Others grew cruel from the power imbalance. Beatings were common. Verbal torment was constant. Some guards would play games, telling a prisoner they'd be released the next day, only to come back and say it was a joke. Not because it helped anything, but because they could. This extended to the justice process too. Trials, when they happened, were often performative. Especially in places like England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, where courts were deeply entangled with power politics. Accused of a crime? You might wait months before you saw a judge. Or you might never. Some prisoners died before they ever had the chance to plead. Others were tortured into confessions. There was a method called peine forte et dure, strong and harsh punishment. If a prisoner refused to enter a plea, they'd be laid on the ground. A board placed on their chest. And slowly, stones added. One at a time. Until the prisoner spoke. Or suffocated. Refusing to plead became its own form of death sentence. Why refuse? Because in some places, entering a guilty plea meant your property was seized, leaving your family destitute. Refusing meant your family kept your land, even if it killed you. So men and women lay there, crushed inch by inch, to protect the people they loved. We talk about medieval prisons as dark. And they were. But sometimes, they were worse when the sun did come in. Because it meant another day had passed. Another day of waiting. Another day of being forgotten. Imagine that rhythm. Wake up, if you slept. Stare at stone. Let's return to the cell. It's still dark. Still cold. But now, it's quieter. Not silent. Exactly. There's a kind of humming, not from the air, or the walls, but from your own mind. After weeks, or maybe months, the world inside becomes louder than the one outside. You begin to imagine. Not escape, that's too far. Too distant. But memory. The smell of bread. The warmth of sunlight on wood. A voice you loved but can't quite remember. This was one of the worst tortures of medieval imprisonment. Not what they did to you, but what they took from you. Your sense of self. Medieval prisoners weren't just isolated from others. They were often isolated from themselves. Because when every day looks the same, stone, shadow, drip, time loses shape. And so do you. But there were others in these places too. Sometimes, cells held dozens of people together. Crammed, sick, fighting for space. Diseases moved faster than breath. Lice jumped from beard to blanket to skin. Sleep was interrupted by coughs, cries, rats, and always, The stench. Human waste piled in corners. Food rotted if left uneaten. The air grew thick. There was no air circulation. No light beyond what cracks allowed. Some prisoners tried to mark time. Scratching tallies on the wall. Composing songs in whispers. Praying aloud, not always to God, but to anyone who might hear. Even the rats. In fact, some prisoners came to see rats not as pests, but as company. Something alive in the dark. Something real. One prisoner, in a French chronicle, named his cell rats, fed them crumbs, spoke to them every night. When the rats vanished for 3 days, he thought he'd gone mad. Then he heard the guard say, "Poisoned the lot, you were getting too friendly." He didn't speak for weeks after that. And speaking of guards, it's worth remembering they weren't always villains. Sometimes, they were just other victims of the same brutal system. A jailer might be a former soldier, wounded and discarded, or a peasant paid in bread and rations to watch the keys. But they held power, and that power could warp a man. One day, a guard gives you extra water. The next, he pours it out in front of you, just to see your reaction. Control becomes a game. Sometimes, guards would set prisoners against each other, promise favors for betrayal, or worse, set up false hopes. "You'll be released tomorrow," they'd say. Or, "The bishop wants to see you. He's found your name in the pardon scrolls." The prisoner, trembling with joy, might clean themselves with stale water, might pray louder than usual. And then, nothing. It was all a lie. No one came. And that hope? It hurt more than the cold. Because the worst kind of torture wasn't the rack, or the stocks, or even hunger. It was hope denied. But there were trials. Eventually. And they weren't always public spectacles. Sometimes, they were quiet, brief, and bureaucratic. A scribe, a clerk, a judge in a borrowed robe. You'd be brought in, half-starved. Eyes unable to bear the candlelight. Asked a few questions. Did you confess? Did someone witness it? Did your family send coin? Answers didn't always matter. Verdicts were often decided in advance, especially if land or inheritance was involved. Sometimes, people were imprisoned to keep them out of the way, not because they were guilty, but because they were inconvenient. Especially women. A widow with land might find herself accused of heresy or adultery. A noble's daughter, resisting an arranged marriage, might be confined for reflection. Sometimes in a tower, sometimes in a convent, sometimes in a cell not meant for the living. Because make no mistake, medieval prisons were also political tools. Rulers used them to silence rivals. Bishops used them to crush dissent. Merchants used them to ruin competitors. All it took was a bribe, a whisper, or a signature on a scroll. And you were gone. And no one dared ask why. But what about escape? Did people ever get out? Yes, sometimes. A well-placed bribe, a sympathetic guard, a lucky fire. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt in England, rebels stormed London and opened the gates of Newgate Prison. Dozens of prisoners ran free. Some vanished. Some were hunted down and executed. Some became folk heroes, their names sung in taverns, remembered in secret. But these were the lucky few. Most stayed. And when they did leave, it was not on their feet. It was in a cart, or a sack, or a wheelbarrow of bones. And yet, even in these places, people found strange ways to survive. A priest in Avignon taught fellow prisoners how to chant Gregorian hymns. It's nighttime in the castle. But not the kind of night you see in stories. No banquets. No singing. No firelight flickering on golden goblets. Just damp corridors, thick with mold and secrets. Down below, beneath the kitchens and stables, lies another kind of chamber. A stone room with a wooden door, iron hinges, and a slot for food. Inside, someone who once had power. Someone who once gave orders. Someone who, today, sits on the floor, wrists shackled, tongue swollen, thoughts looping endlessly. This isn't a criminal. It's a noble. And that makes everything worse. Because in the medieval world, power was a double-edged sword. The higher you climbed, the farther you could fall, and the more vicious the prison awaiting you. Political prisoners were treated differently. Not better, just differently. They were often locked away with care. Not in the public jails, but in towers, abbey vaults, dungeons carved for one. These were private cages for public threats. No trial, No charges. Just a decision made over wine. Whispered between bishops and kings. He knows too much. She's a threat. Lock them away. Sometimes, their names were erased from records. Their portraits burned. Their families told to forget. This was called political oblivion a kind of erasure more terrifying than death. You didn't just lose your freedom. You lost your narrative. You were removed from time. Take Eleanor of Brittany. She was a niece to kings. A potential heir. Too dangerous to leave free. So she was imprisoned for nearly 4 decades. No trial. No rebellion. Just locked away. She died in a nunnery. Guarded until the end. Or consider Hugh Despencer the Younger. Advisor to Edward II of England. When the tides turned, he was captured. Tried? No. Dragged. Hanged. Mutilated. Why? Because he had enemies. Because power, in medieval courts, was a gamble. Lose, and the prison waits. And yet, even worse was who got to decide your fate. Not always kings. Not always judges. Sometimes, it was the church. And that brought its own dark rituals. Inquisitorial prisons, especially during the 13th and 14th centuries, weren't necessarily bloodier. But they were colder. More methodical. You were arrested for suspicion of heresy, a word so broad. It could mean disagreeing with a local priest. You were held without knowledge of your accuser. Without knowing the charges. Weeks might pass before you were even questioned. And when you were, the questions were careful. Do you believe as the church teaches? Have you met with strange preachers? Would you confess freely? Answer wrong, or too slowly, and punishment followed. But not always with chains. Sometimes, it was sensory deprivation. No light, no sound, no calendar. Until you broke, or claimed you'd seen visions, of hell, of demons, of yourself in flames. Inquisitors took these visions as proof. Proof of guilt, proof of sin, and so the wheel turned. If you denied the charges, you were tortured. If you confessed, you were still imprisoned, to reflect and repent. Some prisoners tried to outsmart the system. They memorized doctrine, gave perfect theological answers. But the inquisitors were never satisfied. A flawless answer? Too rehearsed. Too clever. Proof of deeper guilt. There was no way out. And those who did survive, they were branded. Literally. A hot iron against the flesh, a cross. A mark. A symbol of shame. Not for redemption, but so the world would know. And avoid you. Now let's return to the physical space again. The cell. The air inside a political dungeon was worse than in common jails. Because it was still. Utterly. Completely still. No footsteps. No shouting drunks. No street noise. Just silence. And when silence lasts too long, it becomes something else. Not peace, but pressure. You start to hear your breath as thunder. Your heartbeat as drumbeats. You imagine the stones whispering. Because silence in these cells was never empty. It was full of things unsaid. Things forbidden. Things that waited just beyond hearing. Some noble prisoners kept journals, etched with nails. Or scratched on wood. Or whispered daily until memorized. But most didn't. Most sat in stillness, wondering what they had done wrong, or, worse, knowing exactly what, and why it had to be hidden. There's a story of a Catalan merchant imprisoned in Valencia. He had witnessed a noble's murder, not committed it. But he saw, and he spoke, and so they locked him away. His cell had no bars. Only a wooden trapdoor. He heard it open once a day. Food, water, then shut. One day, no food came, then 2, then 3. He assumed he would die. On the 4th day, the door opened, not for water, but for freedom. A guard spoke quietly. The man you saw is dead. You're free. He walked into daylight, staggered, and found that 4 years had passed. He had no beard, no hair. Time had dissolved. His name, forgotten. So even freedom, when it came, was cruel. Because the world outside didn't remember him. Didn't want him. To them, he had disappeared. And reappeared a ghost. Many political prisoners felt the same. They outlived the cause, outlived the scandal, but became relics, curiosities, warnings. So tonight, now let's talk about something strange. Money. Because being a prisoner in the Middle Ages didn't always mean misery, if you had coin. Yes, you could buy your way into a better prison experience. In fact, some medieval jails functioned like miniature economies. There were fees. Yes, you heard right, fees. You paid to be jailed. In some cities, prisoners were charged for their food, their bedding, even their chains. This was called garnish. If you couldn't pay it, you got the worst cell, the worst rations, and no blanket. If you could pay, you might get a private room, a window, a fire, even servants. It sounds ridiculous, but it happened. We have records of noble prisoners with access to writing desks, clean linen, and wine. In 1415, the French noble Charles d'Orléans was captured during the Battle of Agincourt and imprisoned in England. He was kept for 25 years, but not in a dark pit. He lived in relative comfort, wrote poetry, received visitors, even played games with his guards. Why? Because his ransom was worth a fortune. He was valuable. So they treated him well, not out of kindness, but out of investment. They needed him alive, sane, and useful. And this wasn't unique. Across Europe, noble or wealthy prisoners were often treated like assets. Captured knights could live in castles. Murderers from rich families might avoid execution by paying a fine, known as **** in early Germanic law. And if a noble had powerful friends, they might be jailed in luxury estates, technically imprisoned. But with gardens, libraries, and even music, compare that to the peasant locked in a wooden box for stealing bread. No bribes, no favors, just rats and silence. So prisons weren't just punishment. They were a reflection of class. Two people might commit the same crime. One lives like a recluse poet. The other dies unnamed in a pit. Justice wasn't blind. It looked at your purse first. And here's something even more absurd. Some prisoners rented their own jail cells. Especially in cities like London, Paris, or Florence, where space was limited. If you had connections, you could choose your prison. Or upgrade. A small bribe to the jailer might get you better meals. A larger one might allow walks outside. Even temporary leave, under escort, to attend church or handle business. This wasn't secret corruption. It was expected. The jailers depended on these fees. Because the state often didn't pay them. So they made money by charging prisoners. It created a strange balance. Jailers didn't want prisoners to die, not because they cared, but because a dead man doesn't pay. In a way, it kept some people alive. But it also meant that poor prisoners suffered more and died more often. There are tales from England where prisoners wrote letters, begging for money. For candles, even for shoes. One man's letter, from 1373, survives. He writes to his cousin, "I have not light to see. I have not soap to wash. They say I owe them 3 pennies more. Or they will take my shirt." A shirt, the last thing he owned. Then there were the ransoms. For high-ranking prisoners of war, being captured wasn't always a death sentence. It was business. Your captor would send letters to your family or your liege lord, demanding gold for your return. The more important you were, the higher the price. Sometimes, the ransomed prisoner had to raise the money himself. He'd write to allies, offer land, promise debts. One knight, taken during the 100 Years' War, was ransomed for 10,000 florins. He spent years repaying it, and died penniless. Another, with no family to help, was left to rot. The captor, having no use for him, released him eventually, with a limp and a permanent cough. And while all this sounds like the prisoners had some control, remember, the jailer could always change the terms. More money demanded, privileged revoked, or worse, the jailer could accuse you of plotting escape and throw you into a worse cell. There was no appeal, no legal safety net, no oversight. Some guards became mini-kings of their domains. They decided who lived comfortably and who suffered. They controlled gossip, news, favors. In some prisons, there were internal hierarchies prisoners forming cliques, managing who got what. If you had gold, you could rise in this strange society. If not, you survived. Barely. But what if you tried to help others? To share food? To offer warmth? Well, some did. There are stories of wealthy prisoners helping the poor. One tale from Spain tells of a merchant who, though imprisoned, shared all his rations. He taught other prisoners how to calculate accounts. When he was released, he left a portion of his fortune to the jail's poorest inmates. But these are rare stories. Most clung to survival, and that meant self-preservation. So prisons, medieval prisons, weren't always filled with screams. Sometimes, they were filled with politics. With currency. With quiet deals behind closed doors. And the prisoner's fate? It was bought, sold, traded. Sometimes for gold. Sometimes for silence. Sometimes, for nothing at all. Tonight, think about how strange that is. That a place built for punishment became a marketplace. Where misery had a price. And peace could be rented. But not for long. Even the wealthiest prisoner eventually runs out. There's a moment in every prisoner's story. A door opens. Not slams shut, opens. Sometimes it's freedom. Sometimes it's death. And sometimes, it's exile. Let's begin with the gentlest version, release. Some prisoners were simply let go. No explanation. No trial. No pardon. Just one day. A key turned, and they were told to leave. But what kind of freedom was that? After years in the dark, the sunlight burned. Food tasted strange. Voices startled. Many freed prisoners walked in circles. Literally. They forgot how to walk in a straight line. One account tells of a monk freed after 12 years. He stepped into the sunlight and wept, not from joy, but confusion. His abbot was dead. His language had changed. Even the town square had moved. And when he tried to tell his story, people laughed. Monks don't go to prison, they said. He lived the rest of his life in silence, tending to chickens. Then there was exile, a punishment that felt like freedom. But wasn't. Being exiled meant leaving your town, your home, your land, forever. You couldn't take much. You couldn't return. Some prisoners preferred execution, because exile was slow death. And yet, for political prisoners, exile was common. Kings and queens couldn't always kill rivals. But they could vanish them. Send them across seas, into deserts, or into convents far away. Live quietly, they'd say, which meant, be forgotten. And they were. We know of dozens of princes, dukes, nobles who vanished into exile and never made it back. Their letters, if they wrote any, were destroyed. Their names whispered only in the corners of old books. Even the church used exile for heretics. You could be cast out. Anathema *, spiritually expelled. No one could house you, feed you, bury you. It was a death of the soul. And what about those who stayed? The executed. The ones who never left their cells. Except carried. Executed prisoners were sometimes made examples. Especially rebels. Their deaths were public spectacles. A warning. But others, the forgotten ones, died quietly. Buried in unmarked graves beneath castle walls. Some were left to rot in their chains. One chronicler wrote of a prison in Rouen where they found 5 skeletons, all still shackled. One had tried to etch words on the wall. Only 2 letters survived, I. The rest lost to stone. But not all endings were grim. Some prisoners changed history from their cells. Take Boethius, a Roman philosopher imprisoned in the 6th century. He wrote, The Consolation of Philosophy, from his dungeon, a book that would influence scholars for centuries. Or Lady Jane Grey, Queen of England for 9 days. Then imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was only a teenager. In her letters, she wrote with clarity, courage, and sorrow. She faced her execution with dignity. Her words became legend, because even in chains, some found their voice. Even in darkness, some left a light behind. And that brings us to you. To now. To this quiet moment, where the past brushes softly against your thoughts. There is no stone cell here. No jailer. No draft beneath the door. Only blankets, breath, and a memory of those who weren't so lucky. Of prisoners who waited for the sound of keys. Who hoped someone would remember them. Tonight, we remember them, not out of fear, or pity, but out of peace. Because history isn't always made by kings. Sometimes, it's etched on dungeon walls. Whispered through cracks. Kept alive in lullabies and poems and dreams. You've traveled through darkness. Through the stink of straw. The whisper of chains. The games of coin and class and silence. Now, let that go. Let it drift. Let it rest. You are not forgotten. You are not lost. You are not waiting for a key. Sleep now. Soft, still, unshackled. Because history may be heavy. But your dreams are free.